Hello, and welcome. It's great to see many of you jumping in. My name's Mike. I'm one of the co-founders here at Waybook.com. And this is probably one of my favorite topics, how to onboard remote employees. So welcome back if you've been to one of our webinars before. And if it's your first webinar, welcome. It's great to see you here. We have a few ways of keeping in contact over the next 45 minutes or so. Of course, you've got the chat, you've got the Q&A function. We've got a few polls coming your way as well. But of course, you can always ask your question in the chat and we'll get onto them either throughout the session or at the end. So we will get going now. Hello and welcome once again. I'd love to hear where some of you are from. I'm based in London at the moment, so please do jump in the chat and where in the world you are. We've had a pretty grey day here, so I'm sure some of you can make us very jealous with your sunny locations and destinations. Okay, we've got Leamington. I don't suppose it's any better for you weather-wise in the UK. Michigan, great to have you here, Sarah. We've got a Dublin. We've got someone in Thailand. I almost can't talk to you because I am a little too jealous. Southern California, Malta, Lancaster, California, in Dallas, working remotely. The beautiful thing about this session and lots of the other sessions we run here at Waybook is that people are all over the world, as I'm sure many of your teams are, and that is exactly what we are here to talk about today. How can we onboard remote employees? As we all know, the world has changed over the last 2 years and our businesses have changed with it. Some of us had businesses that had remote teams already. Many of us have become remote in that time. So what I'm going to do as we get going, I'm just going to launch a little poll to get a sense of how remote your teams are and whether or not you're newly remote in the last couple of years with COVID or whether you've always been remote. In this session, we are going to be going through some of the core fundamentals of how we onboard remote employees. We've worked with thousands of businesses here at Waybook.com that are doing just that. And we've learned lots of different things from the people using Waybook, but also we as a team have also always been remote, so even pre-COVID. To give you a little bit of background, as I mentioned, my name's Mike. I'm one of the co-founders here at Waybook, but Waybook is actually part of a small group of businesses called Turn Partners. We're essentially a startup studio that either acquires and turn around digital businesses or creates new businesses using our core team. And we've always been semi-remote. We're based here in London. We've also got a base in Birmingham in the UK and quite a few international bases. So when COVID hit, we realized that actually we were pretty much set up for it. But even though we were remote before COVID, it really changed how we had to operate and how we had to continue to scale our team. Firstly, we went more remote, dropped some of our locations, but also we had to change the way we did things because semi-remote means we do have these bases. Whereas actually quite right now, we're all over and we don't always get to see each other. So some of the communication we relied on where we would occasionally be in little clusters in the same room, all had to be digitalized. And I'm just going to end that poll now and send that back out to you so we get a sense of who else is in the room. We can see here about 13% are actually all in one location. We've got a couple of people, about 25% people in multi-locations. A few others were semi-remote. So 50% of people are also semi-remote and a few fully remote. Many of you, 25% of you, were always that way. Some of you have been temporarily affected by COVID, but the vast majority are embracing this new way of working since COVID. So on that, let's get going. What we're going to cover in today is we're going to be going through planning these roles and planning to be remote, how we hire people. We're going to be looking at what we can do to set up for remote employees. One of the core things you'll get from this webinar is that how we onboard remote employees is actually a lot about what we do before they even begin. We're then also going to look at what we do in their week ones. And there's a little, there is an intentional S after week one. And then also we're going to be looking at how we can continue to iterate and improve on our processes and our onboarding to make sure that we can continue to have a high impact as we move through. So let's begin. But first, let's think about what success actually looks like. So the 63% of you that have now newly gone remote because of COVID, it's not all bad. Yes, we're losing those water cooler moments. Yes, we can't just train by osmosis anymore and assume that people will overhear things in the office. But there's so much opportunity to be had from being remote. Firstly, it's this whole concept of accessing talent anywhere. And I'm not just talking about the geographic abilities to access talent in different locations. I'm talking about the ability to access talent that are still in businesses that have to be physically located. The whole working world, as we know, is in flux. And with that, motivations and expectations and technology has changed, which means that if we are remote businesses and we do that well, we can actually incentivize new people in new ways. And you've seen a lot of people changing how they want to work. Quite often, some of the top talent from the top businesses are leaving for other businesses because of that flexibility and that choice around life. The other core thing that we get from this is just the geographic arbitrage. Now, some of us here are based in the UK, the US, and other countries, which means that actually typically some of our average wage costs might be higher. And this whole concept of geographic arbitrage, working with amazing talent in locations that have a lower cost of living and lower wages, actually means that we can provide amazing lifestyles for our team members, access really great talent, and it be more efficient for the business. Now, this geographic arbitrage has happened for years and years in many different businesses. The big corporates, PwC's, Accenture, Deloitte, all of these have big international teams. Many people have different development teams in different locations, but the barrier has always been scale. It's always been quite complex for us to have these physical locations to access this talent, but not anymore, my friends. We can access all of that talent, be it one employee or two. And then the other concept here is actually looking at how we enrich our culture. So yes, diversity is absolutely key for driving a lot of our businesses forward. And that diversity comes from us being able to access amazing people that bring new perspectives, new cultures into our team, changing how we operate, who we operate with, and that really can have a massively, profoundly positive impact on what we produce and, of course, access new markets. So the benefits are real, and it's not just these hypothetical benefits that we're talking about. That it's proven that having a great onboarding experience can actually really benefit our teams and our business. Boston Consulting Group did some research on this, looking at teams that have a higher graded onboarding experience and compared their performance to teams and businesses that had lower graded onboarding strategies. And as you see it in a massive writing there, 2.5 times revenue growth. So 2.5 times more revenue growth was achieved by those businesses that had better onboarding processes. And that's what works out to be about 1.9 times the profit margin. Now, this is no accident. And of course, these businesses that have better onboarding strategies also tend to have better processes and management and way of working. And that's exactly what we're tapping into today. So let's begin. Point number 1 of 5 is about planning. And this core aspect is based on the principle that we always think about here in Waybook, that ambiguous expectations expect ambiguous results. Now, we've been able to get away from this when we're working in a room with someone for years gone by. We set a bit of a direction, we say what we're trying to work on, and we can be agile with how we change and adapt. Because actually, if we can see someone's working on something that might not be the absolute optimal, we can course correct and go through. But more than ever in the world of remote, having this ambiguity in anything we're doing, what we're expecting, who's the right person, what our focuses are, means that actually the variety of outputs we get from these ambiguous inputs is large and scary, essentially. So this initial phase of planning, actually who our roles are, what the business is structured, and where these people are going to be is an absolute essential step. So the core facets, the core things to think about within this planning phase is to really think about what type of role are we looking to create. Now, when I say type of role, this can mean a lot of different things, but one of the core distinguishments that I'm really excited to share with you is this concept of core versus explore. Now, what I mean by this is most roles in a business can be defined as core or explore. And this is an amazing concept which is generated by our friends at Unkillable, a really great onboarding and innovation agency. And essentially what this concept is, our jobs as business owners, founders, and senior leaders is quite often to explore. We're quite often out in the wild, finding out new ways of doing new things. That's how we drive our business forward. And realistically, as an entrepreneur or a business owner, business leader, we want to try and optimize our time to explore as much as possible. And in order for us to scale our teams, as soon as we've figured out how something works, we can then turn that into a core activity. Now, that may be the fact that we've hired somebody once and we know what the interview questions are, we know what we're looking for, we know how we're doing our onboarding, and then that explore activity of finding out the best way of doing something becomes a core activity. We can document that, we can share that with our teams, and we can pass that accountability on. Now, when we're looking to plan out a new role, we need to understand, is that explore or is it explore? Because the fundamental things we're looking at, how we onboard them, how we introduce these people, will be wildly different. The second thing to remember is that we should always have, even when it's an explore area, we should always have clear responsibilities. Now, one of the best expressed concepts of this is looking at the amazing book E-Myth by Michael Gerber. It's a bit of an oldie, but it's a goldie. And what Michael Gerber and E-Myth suggests is that even when we're scaling our organizations, be that from 0 to 20, 20 to 1,000, essentially what we should do is map out what the next year or so of our organization is. Look at what the business needs to do in order to operate and map that from an organizational structure perspective. As soon as we understand what those roles are, what those responsibilities are, our job then is just finding the right people to take on the right roles. And it may well be the fact that each person has multiple roles and activities until you add a new person in. Now, having these clear responsibilities lined out before we even begin recruiting means that actually we can remove the ambiguity and we have that clear path of growth of how we want to expand out our teams. The next thing we're going to look at is actually how we can then set really clear expectations. So yes, we've mapped out our organizational structure. The next thing is, what are the expectations of those roles? So each role, each person, we've set these expectations out and we can share that with people. So what are the clarifying outputs that we've got? What times do we expect to do various different things? And also, when can somebody know when they've been successful or not? As we discuss this a little bit more, I've just launched a poll to get a sense from people in the audience here about whether or not you have this mapped out. We're on this call because we're probably going to be onboarding remote employees, which means we're probably hiring people. So do you have your core organizational structure and roles? The next thing that we can consider, and this is so essential, it's always been valuable and important, but it's so essential for a remote onboarding role, is to have a super clear operating rhythm. Now, what do I mean by operating rhythm? Essentially, we all have operations within our business. We all have systems and processes, and whether they're documented or not, we know the things that need to happen within our business. There's a few activities each of us do. There's ways that we might set goals. There's ways that we might share them with our team. And then we also have a good communication structure, or whether it's good or not, we often have a communication structure. That may be unstructured, as in, if the shop is on fire, give me a call, or it may be a regular meeting. It may be a monthly review. It may be something that we actually have specific touch points and one-on-ones and mentor meetings and things like that. But what an operational rhythm is where we have, is the intersection between our operations, how we operate what we do, and our communication structure. And this can be as simple as a list of who interacts with who, what the purpose of that meeting is, what the purpose of that touch point is, and how often it happens. And this operating rhythm means that we know that every new employee, where we can see what they're doing, where we can see, give them an opportunity to communicate, share, and collaborate. And essentially, this is what we can set our goals. This is where we have our calls, our meetings, and also our social. One thing that people often forget with remote teams is that they get on with their own life and we do what happens. But we almost need to factor in the social elements of this team building and this team culture into our operating rhythm, which many people weren't really doing before. So think about what that means to you. And again, you don't have to overplan this. There's loads of support we can provide on helping structure your operating rhythm. Now, I'm just going to end and share this poll. It's quite fascinating. So out of everybody on the call, only 11% have an updated and accessible organizational structure and roles. 56% of people don't have it, and about 33% of people do have it, but it's not accessible. Now, the good thing is, if you don't have it, and I'm saying how important it is, it doesn't matter because you're not alone, but it's also really easy to do. With these sorts of exercises, you can spend a week on it, or you can actually just spend a couple of hours with a pen and paper jotting down what needs to happen in your business and creating that structure. And I promise you, it makes everything else easier, not just for your mind, but also for communicating that with your growing teams. So this is stage one. We've planned. We know who the sort of activities, or what sort of activities are and what characters we need. We have these clear responsibilities that are mapped out from a business level and have specific expectations for the role we're hiring for. And we have an operational rhythm, so we know how that role integrates with the rest of the business. What's next? We can hire. Now, some of you may be HR professionals, some of you may have never hired anyone before, but actually the most important thing to remember with this is that first impressions matter. And typically, the earlier the impression, the more impactful that will be in our hiring process. Now, the reason why I've put this little quote here regarding hiring rather than the onboarding is because the onboarding starts at the hiring. This is about us setting expectations when we're creating job roles, when we have a website that shows that we're hiring, where we're posting these jobs, how we're wording these jobs. And throughout this whole process of hiring, we're setting these expectations. We're building our employer brand. We're setting the cadence of how we communicate, how responsive we are. Now, in the same way that we might judge a candidate coming into a job by saying, I replied to that, or they kept on leaving attachments off of the email, or they've done an exceptional job and everything looks beautiful, they're also thinking that for us. And one of the biggest changes with remote work is that people are actually able to work remotely, which means their job opportunities are massive. So it's as competitive for us as it is for the candidates. What are the fundamental things we need to think about in our hiring process? Firstly, it has to be strong and, most importantly, consistent. Now, the reason why I'd highly recommend having a strong and consistent process is because, firstly, it is fair for all of our candidates, and it just gives us a huge amount of clarity. If you work in a university or a big corporate, typically we'll have question sets that you're asking people. Now, yes, that process can be a little bit rigid, but what it does do is it adds us a really easy comparative situation for us to be able to see how one candidate compares to another. Now, even if that's a foundation of an interview or a conversation, or we have topics or points that we're looking to discuss, at least then when we're taking a step back to see whether they're the right person for the right role within the organization, we're able to do that. And the other core thing with that is it means that we don't have to rethink this process every time we look to hire somebody or every time a candidate comes in. Having one process, having it written, means that actually we can just simply optimize and improve that experience. So I'll actually just share my screen now and give you a little bit of a sense about one of our internal hiring processes. I'm just showing you inside of a Waybook here. And in this Waybook, you can see that for each of our roles, we have the process outlined. So our process has 7 fundamental roles, which is essentially an application form on Recruity. We then actually pass almost all of our participants through to an asynchronous video interview. This is a new step for us, and that was actually because of the remote change. We found that actually we were spending a lot of time on the first part of the recruitment process because a lot of people were applying for a lot of jobs. So when people do an initial application, yes, answering questions, we actually then send them a reply with a link to an interview. Now this is obviously one that I've recorded here, where it's just a couple of short videos asking them questions that they can either type or video or voice back. Now, it's amazing how many people fall out at that step. And really for us, that's a signal that they either aren't the right fit or they don't want a job in the organization and they're just scattering their applications. Next up, we have an initial interview. We do a business case and a challenge, and we do synchronous video interviews and team meets. So this is our strong process. This is the structure we use. And actually, we even have the form questions, what we're looking for each of these different roles as well. Now that's repeatable. You don't need to rethink that, and it's super easy. Now, the second part is how we can ensure that we provide as much context throughout the hiring process. Now, I mentioned before that these first impressions matter, and they matter because we're selling the business as well as we're trying to hire that person. So in each stage of the interview, think about what information you can provide them to give them the best chance of learning more about the business, and also give us the best chance of understanding how they'd operate within our world. So to give you an example of that, at stage 3, after this asynchronous video interview, so after the initial synchronous video interview, we then actually send them a business case. So each candidate would get access to a business case, and we share this publicly viewable link, and they're actually then able to go through some contextual information about the business that they're applying for. They can understand the stages, they can read about the role, they can understand the background of the business, understand the core values, how we started, the industry, things like this. And then actually at the end of this kind of piece of information, we set that person a challenge, and then we give them an easy step for them to book into a video call, and that's how they schedule their next stage of the interview. Now, it's amazing what we see when we send this to some people in our process, because quite often people don't even see the ability to book, or they don't do the challenge, which means that actually the core fundamental communication skills that is essential for us to work remotely may not be present or not present in that current situation. So it's a really important testing out and sharing how we operate to give them context, and actually a bit of a test to make sure the participants or the candidates are a good fit for us as a team. So provide that context throughout those hiring process, and that really enables this kind of mutual benefit to give them information and to find fit for us. You may have heard this before, but it's important to hire for values. Now, if you have a strong set of values within your organization, and that is how you operate, this is the bedrock of the culture within our businesses. And it's really difficult to share those values or inject those values when we are remote. Now, it's fair to say that skill sets are actually easier to find in a global market, and they're also easier to learn. But it's harder to find the alignment on the values, who we are and how we operate. So definitely keep that in front of mind when you're having these conversations. From a remote team perspective, typically previously someone would come into an office and they might see a few people and get a sense of who's part of the team as they're going through. Obviously, onboarding people remotely, you just don't get that. So we always ensure that we have an opportunity for people to meet the team as much as possible throughout the process. Either their direct reports that are within, or actually we have a team meet as one of our last stages, which is an opportunity for us to sense check the culture as a team, but also it involves the team in the decision. Now, that is a very small change, but it really empowers our existing team, and it gets people excited about the new people that's being onboarded, which means there's an increased and shared sense of responsibility when that new person appears on Slack or Teams or whatever internal chat you're using, for them to welcome and be a part of that onboarding process. The other thing to consider here, and this goes for remote and non-remote businesses, is to consider the impact on your team and your culture. A little calculation I like to do is, if you plus one person to your team, what percent do they then make up of that team? If you're a team of 19 and you're adding one person in, that person is going to be a 5% contributor to your culture. Of course, it means that actually as the business gets bigger, they might have a smaller impact on the culture of that organization or their individual unit, but it's a really important thing to consider. And we owe it to them and to the whole team to give the best welcome and the best onboarding experience possible. And then, of course, it's important for people to have one-on-one time with their core reports. And this, again, is for mutual benefit, for them to understand how we operate as a business, and for participants to be able to start building that rapport and relationship with the people they're going to be spending all day, every day with. So that takes us to the end of step 2 of hiring. Next up is the setup. I did say at the top of the session that a lot of the prep that we do, or a lot of the value we add on the remote onboarding, is actually largely done before somebody starts. And this is where a lot of that value is created. So the core thing to bear in mind is that when we're remote, if it's not documented and if it's not accessible, it simply does not exist. It's really difficult for us to communicate things like we normally would do in person. It's hard to just show someone, it's hard for somebody else to observe what's happening, which we might have had previously in an office. So the fundamental part of setting up is making sure that anything that's essential to how we operate as a team is documented and accessible in some way, shape, or form. So looking at the specifics within this, it's all about actually creating these centralized documents. So essentially, it's about considering what knowledge you have and where that lives. Now, this could be something like an employee handbook showing the culture, the history, the shared experiences of the team, or it could be the core standard operating procedures, the SOPs, the insights, the knowledge, the processes that live within your business. Now, of course, at Waybook, we're an onboarding and training tool, and we are entirely focused around the sharing of this essential knowledge and making it always accessible and available to your team, keeping your whole team on the same page. So anything that happens within any of our businesses within the group gets documented, gets shared, and gets iterated together. So it means that empowers people to answer their own questions. The second thing to consider here is to then plan out as intricately as you can those first 2 weeks. Now, within the first 2 weeks, we have a few different stages. We essentially have the concepts of introducing people socially to our team. That gets that human buy-in. And I know a lot of businesses in the beginning of COVID started onboarding remote teams, but in a way that they would on people that were physically there. And a lot of these hires didn't work because the mechanisms weren't in place to get people socially bought into the team, the culture, and the way of working. The second thing is, of course, the commercial aspects. Understanding what the business is, how we're operating, and what are the fundamental aspects of growing and building that business. The other part is to consider the distinct difference between orientation, onboarding, and execution. Now, the core differences are, within an orientation process, we're essentially just showing somebody around. So think of this as the equivalent of bringing someone into the office, the shop, the resort, wherever you work, and showing them and talking to them and being a human connection with them, actually being able to be hands-on with what people are doing. That is orientation. It's bringing people into a tool-based environment where they can build those connections and have a holistic understanding. Onboarding is more specifically focused on what that person's role is and how they execute. The purpose of onboarding is to essentially get them to be able to be executing on their role effectively, working with people in their current positions, understanding the cadence, the expectations, and the specific training and information around how they execute on the role. And then finally, of course, they can execute and add all of that amazing value. So planning these 2 weeks is all about understanding and clarifying what those expectations are, what those outputs are, whilst ensuring that there's time for that digestion. If somebody came in on the first day, you wouldn't throw a handbook, everybody talk at the same time. So plan out that first 2 weeks with a cadence that actually avoids that overwhelm. How do you want that momentum to be? What experience do you want them to have? And how does that align to yours and their expectations? A great thing here is sharing that in advance as much as you can. So talk about this throughout the hiring process to make sure people are happy and excited about what their first couple of weeks look like. And then the final thing is not just set up for you, but it's set up for your team members. One of the fundamental differences that everybody feels, but not many people talk about, is that the room that I'm in here is fundamentally different to the room that every single one of you on this webinar are in. And that's a very different concept for people who've worked in offices or shops or buildings before. Because we can control the temperature, we can control the music, the sound, the vibe, the energy. And businesses spend millions on doing this in a really effective way. But if somebody's working from their bedroom and there's drilling outside and they're on an uncomfortable chair, we're not in the same room. And therefore, we're not on the same page. And it's really difficult to have that alignment. So try and aid people to have the most effective setup. What's important to your business? Do people need to have a certain machine, a certain webcam, a certain type of chair, devices? Is it important that you have clear audio? Consider their situation, their connection to the team and their surroundings, and try and align that as much as possible to the rest of the team. Really simple point, but far too often overlooked. So they are largely your three things to focus on when you're planning. Now let's get into week one. And really the most important thing here to consider is that the momentum that you establish within 3 days, the first 3 days, takes around 30 days to amend or create that same impact. It essentially means that the first 3 days sets that momentum and cadence of how we operate, who we operate, how we communicate for basically the lifetime of that employee. And you'll notice there's 2 weeks. Week ones means that the first one is the -1. So week one does not begin on the first day of your contract. Week one begins the week before the first day of that person starting. We call it week -1. And I promise you it's as important as any other time period in the early stage of that team member. Now, what we try and do here is give people the essential access they need to feel part of the team, feel connected, and be equipped to do their best work. Now, this could be having access to the documents that they need, the background. Some of this you might have shared throughout the hiring process. But what about getting your account set up? Too often, people start a new job and they spend the first day and a half setting up their laptop, setting up their email addresses, getting connected, speaking to people. This should all be done in advance, because you've got to remember that on a day one before, people might be surrounded by conversation, they might go out for lunch. That's not the case with remote employees. So actually have all of the admin stuff set up in advance and to your team members as quickly as possible within the week -1. Then week one is actually all entirely focused on orientation, and then we move into the onboarding. Within this orientation, it's always great, no matter how well documented all of your processes, knowledge, welcome videos from the CEO and the founders, it's really useful to have a human welcome. Now, it doesn't have to be the first minute of the first day, but it's quite important to have somebody having that human connection and that human conversation within that first day. One thing that we've liked to do and have seen this work exceptionally well across lots of businesses is to have a team buddy. And what this basically means is anybody within the team, and they don't even need to work in their same department. It actually works well when they don't. They're buddied up with them for the first few weeks, and they're almost responsible for answering some of the silly questions and answering some of the kind of orientation points and introducing them to different people. Now, this team buddy is almost the friendly face inside that isn't their boss, but somebody that they can count on as a friend and as an accountability partner from that day one. Whenever we've seen this implemented well within businesses that use Waybook, typically those team buddies that are assigned in the first week become probably the closest connections people continue to have within their working way. The other thing to consider within the first week is for them to meet as many team members as possible without overwhelming or stacking up that diary. We always recommend that a new team member should at least have one call with one person in each department and a call with each of the people that they're working with. And ideally, this should be a one-on-one conversation, giving them the ability to understand what their life is like and what their working world is like, how they operate, and have the opportunity to build that rapport, that it's not just a name and an avatar behind the chat app that you're using. And then in this first week, it's all about expectation setting. So although some of this would have been done throughout the hiring process and the information you've provided, it's really important for us to be able to say what is the expectation of the business and success for that role. Again, ambiguity is the main issue within these onboarding remote teams. So removing that ambiguity by setting those expectations really strengthens our position and our team's ability to do excellent work. So a lot of this is orientation. And as we slip within the onboarding, we always try and encourage people to do daily challenges and daily actions in order to transition from orientation to onboarding. Now, what this may be for a content marketing manager, as I showed you a process of earlier, may actually be amending a piece of strategy or creating a piece of content, or one thing that's actually focused on the output that they will be achieving from their second week onwards, but actually doing it in a safe space where they're able to bridge this gap between orientation, onboarding, before they get into that expectation or the higher expectation execution stage. And then the final thing to consider within these week ones, and of course, moving forward as we continue to manage our remote team, is to protect synchronous time as much as possible. Now, I couldn't stress this enough, because people who do this well have incredibly fighting fit teams, and people who do this badly, unfortunately, have fractured teams that are difficult to keep on the same page. And what I mean by this is just the very basic concept that human touch points are now a much lower percentage of our working world. If I'm in an office with you for 8 hours, we'll probably have a lot of those hours within earshot, the ability to speak to each other, and the understanding of who you are and how you operate. Right now, when we're remote, that time that we're synchronously together, that we're on a video call or we're on a telephone call, is probably maximum 10% of that working time, which means that that time is truly precious. It's the only time that we have that enables us to build that culture, build that rapport, and create that expectation and relationship that creates highly effective teams. And I must give credit to actually Isabel, who is on this call, was the person that actually observed this in other businesses and was the person that kind of crystallized this thought in the working world at how important this truly is for us. And then finally, don't be afraid to optimize for fun. Now, it's not always appropriate to optimize for fun on every call, but it is really important for us to remember that if people are working 8 hours of their life and they're choosing to work remotely because they're trying to optimize their time, their life, their balance, those 8 hours can also be fun. Everybody is a human. And as we're working more remote, we're invited into people's houses, their kitchens, their bedrooms, and we don't need to pry into other people's lives. But it does mean that we have this level of closeness that we wouldn't have when people put on a mask and come into an office. So utilize that to actually build these relationships and make sure people are enjoying each other's company. And we can do that in a whole host of different ways, which I will suggest some specific potentials as we move into the bonus section very soon. And then the fifth and final facet when we're looking at how to effectively onboard remote teams is to be customer-centric and then put them to work. And this is the concept of continuous improvement and iteration. Now, when we're talking about onboarding remote teams, our customers are, of course, our new team members. So as we would do in any other part of our business, it's always important to focus on the customer and get as close to them as possible. Customer discovery really does exist internally as much as it does externally. So one thing we like to do is to conduct entrance interviews. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the concept of exit interviews, where we ask these questions like, how equipped were you for your role? What was the experience? What happened? What could we improve on? But we should be doing this within the first month of somebody onboarding. Now, it might not be getting information on the whole business, but they can certainly give a very insightful and refreshed view about their onboarding experience as a remote team member. And this is an iterative approach. The world will continue to change, technology continues to adapt, and we should continue to optimize our onboarding experience. So embodying that commitment to continuous improvement, it means that every time we onboard a new remote employee, that person can contribute to the process and will continue to get stronger and better and more effective. The one final thing I would suggest when we come to this iteration and how we continue this effective onboarding into effective management is, where possible, to cross these cohorts as much as possible. Typically, when somebody enters a business, they're normally sat next to one of the most senior people, or they're put in a group that have been friends for years and worked on particular things. And from a remote perspective, that can sometimes feel quite isolating because they're entering a group that they feel like the outsider. Now, that's not always the case, of course, but when you don't understand the group dynamics of the team and how things are structured, it actually is very difficult to understand that from behind the screen. So this concept of cross cohorts is all about involving your newest recruits into the onboarding process of your next recruits. And this really creates an increased mutual inclusion for the new hires to be empowered and responsible for bringing on even newer people. But of course, it means that actually, if I've joined a company and somebody's helping onboard me who's literally been there for 3 weeks, I know that I'm part of that group, which is connected to the other group. And then actually it really builds a strong and cohesive team. So these are a couple of concepts and insights to think about when we're onboarding remote employees. Now, of course, largely it's done by great and new technology. So I thought I'd share some of the tech that we like to use within our businesses, and we've seen used really effectively across businesses that use Waybook. So when we're looking at hiring, you can, of course, use lots of different tools for this. Internally, we use Recruiting, but there's also Workable, there's Go Hire, and this is basically applicant tracking software that can reduce our time and increase the consistency and effectiveness of executing our hiring process. Then, of course, when we get to communication, Async, Slack is obviously the big one, Teams, but WhatsApp is used increasingly by a lot of our teams and businesses using Waybook that are in shops or gyms or not computer-based. For synchronous, Zoom is always an absolute winner, but of course you've got Google Meet, you've got Blue Jeans, and there's now a whole new breed of event-based synchronous tools, where instead of having lots of screens in front of you, you might be an avatar and moving and working around. Now, because a lot of these are quite new and relatively untested, I've not got them as our firm recommendations, but what I would recommend is to experiment. Things will work for your team that may not work for others. And actually, even just the process of trying new forms of communication together is a very good bonding experience. For knowledge, training, and onboarding, I accept I might be a little bit biased on this one, but of course, Waybook is the tool for you to centralize your knowledge, documents, SOPs, information, onboarding experiences. That really becomes your single source of truth. That helps you with that hiring process, that enables you to share the right information with the right people, but also, and crucially, it enables you to track what information your new hires and your existing teams have seen, what they've understood. You can even do tests and assessments within Waybook, essentially to make sure and give you the confidence that your team is all on the same page, but also to empower your employees to have access to the right information in order for them to do their most incredible work. Then, of course, one of the final pieces, particularly important for this onboarding process, is this concept of using project management tools, that now we understand what we're doing and how we're doing it and how we operate. You might want to use a Trello, Asana, Miro, or Monday to actually track different projects and processes moving forward. So these are our top tool tips. And the final thing I'd like to share with you before we go to Q&A is a couple of things that we've learned that actually really saved us time and increased our effectiveness. So one thing that might not be doable for all of us, but it's, if possible, it's amazing, is to onboard in cohorts where possible. Now, this idea I shared earlier of cross-pollinating our cohorts is really easily done when actually we're onboarding in cohorts. So we can bring 2 or 3 people in at one time. It means that it decreases the time of investment of that onboarding process. And it means that people naturally have a tribe or a group of people that they can enter that working relationship with. Of course, centralize your knowledge and your tools as much as possible. So quite often people will have various documents in Google Drive, in Dropbox, in Notion, all over. But actually just the time it takes to have those repetitive questions of where are the logo files, or how do we do this, or how do I book holiday, really consumes a lot of people's time. And one thing that we don't see within remote teams is that if I fire a message to HR to ask something, or if I ask the CEO or my line manager, I'm disrupting their flow, because if I was looking at them in the office and they're deep in design work or something interesting, I might not distract them, whereas actually it's unfiltered and a bit chaotic when it's remote. So actually having this centralized information that's importantly accessible for your team empowers them to answer their own question. I mentioned before, but I would highly recommend pairing your new people with the team buddy. And the other concept is to use mixed media for everything, synchronous and asynchronous conversation. Really try not to send long emails with a list of links. Really try not to send long worded PDFs. Maybe use videos for parts of your onboarding experience. Maybe use phone calls rather than just staring at a screen all the time. Try experiment with walking meetings, experiment with on the phone and all different things. But this richness of having mixed media means that actually, instead of our working world being in a 3D office, it is now in our screens. So mixing that up as much as possible really enhances the experience for our new hires. Try and mix your large and your small meetings. So instead of having all hand meetings all of the times or only one-on-ones, a mix of them enables us to be able to understand each of our team members individually and enable us to create that group culture. And of course, inject fun where you can and where appropriate. So we do this in various different ways. We've done things like bake-alongs where we've got a bit of a chef in our team within Waybook. So she's helped us create various different brownies. We've done treasure hunts, obviously quizzes, things like that. And although some of these can sometimes feel a little bit stilted, they are a great way for us to be able to create an air of human and team enjoyment within that. Now, there's a few book recommendations which we've got. One of them that I've put here is the first 90 days of how we can continue to enhance and do this. It's not specifically remote, and a lot of the core concepts I've shared with you previously, but there's a few other concepts we can do. So we'll come back to this, but we do have a swag giveaway. So I know that actually sitting here for 50 minutes listening to me talk may not be the mixed media that I have suggested is important, but Isabel is busy in the background picking out a random name, and when Isabel can share that name in the chat, we've got some swag to send your way to make sure that you're looking and feeling comfortable when you're working remote. But the next steps for us to be able to move forward, and then we'll go into Q&A, is using the onboarding checklist where available, making sure that actually we've got an onboarding checklist which we'll make sure is sent out to all of you, which includes a lot of this concept, to try and focus on what actually needs to be done, and just use this checklist to make sure that even if you're not doing a stage of it, you're consciously not doing it for a reason. The second part is all of this content which we've shared today and all of the processes that I've shared are available for free in your Waybook. So if you are an existing Waybook customer, you can just message into customer support, say that you want the how to onboard remote team members. They'll get that into your Waybook, and you can just amend those processes and start onboarding highly effectively from today. You can also book a call with a Waybook expert. We're very friendly, and we're always happy to talk about how you onboard your teams and how you create structures and processes within your business. Now, I've seen in the chat that Isabel has picked our lucky winner. So congratulations, Chris. You've won yourself some Waybook swag. You were currently in Dallas, so I'm not sure what the weather's like in Dallas, but maybe you don't want the fluffy jumper. We will get something over to you. We'll send you some credit so you can get that from the Waybook swag store. So thank you all so much for joining. It's amazing to speak to you, and we've got lots of different webinars coming up in our webinar series and lots of content that we're excited to get engaged with you to help get your business on the same page and scaling smoothly. So thank you for coming. We are now going into the Q&A. So please feel free to ask your questions either in the Q&A tab or of course in the chat. We have Alana. That's an easy one. Alana's asking for a link to schedule a call with a Waybook specialist to build process. Absolutely. We'll get that link straight over to you. And you can book that call. Thank you very much, Sarah. Very informative. Great to meet you. And I hope there's some gems in there that you can take and continue to scale your business. Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining. I'm going to bring this call to a close now. I look forward to seeing you in our up and coming webinars. For those of you who are Waybook customers, thank you very much as always. And we look forward to continuing to support you grow your business and keep it all on the same page. I've been Mike Bander, one of the co-founders here at Waybook.com, and you've been amazing. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Bye-bye.